7:32 p.m., Austin, Texas. The room felt colder than it should have. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Sign it or leave. That's the only choice you have. Daniel Crowe said it calmly, like he was explaining the weather. His voice settled into the kitchen and stayed there, heavy, unmoving. The overhead light hummed faintly, casting a pale yellow circle on the table between us. Outside, cicadas sang like nothing in the world had changed. Inside, something had. For a moment, nobody moved. The refrigerator clicked on low and steady. The wall clock ticked, slow, deliberate, unforgiving. I felt the cool edge of the wooden chair beneath my palms. My hands were trembling, but not the way he probably expected. Not fear, not confusion. It was something sharper. Recognition. I had heard that tone before in my life, the tone men use when they believe the conversation is already over. Daniel didn't look at me when he slid the papers forward. He aligned the pages neatly, tapped them twice with his finger, and exhaled, like this was an inconvenience. "It's all standard," he said. "We've been over this." No, I thought. You've talked. I've listened. I glanced down at the documents. Thick, too thick. My name printed in bold letters, neat and official. My house. My signature line waiting patiently at the bottom, like a trap with manners. The air felt stale warmer near the ceiling, colder at my feet. I shifted slightly and heard the faint scrape of paper against paper. My phone lay face down near my elbow, its black screen reflecting the light above us. Daniel's knee bounced once, then stopped. He thought this moment belonged to him. He thought silence meant surrender. He doesn't know someone else is listening, I reminded myself, slow and steady. "Eleanor," he said, finally looking up, softening his voice just enough to sound reasonable. "This doesn't have to be difficult." I met his eyes. There was no anger in them, no guilt either. Just certainty, the kind that comes from believing an old woman doesn't have options. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, measured and calm, like it had decided to wait and see what I would do next. I didn't answer him. Instead, I reached forward slowly, deliberately, and slid the faded manila envelope closer to my side of the table. The paper whispered as it moved. Daniel noticed. His eyes flicked down for half a second. Not long enough to ask questions. Let him wonder, I thought. Let him keep talking. The clock kept ticking. The phone stayed silent, and I kept my hand resting on that envelope, feeling its weight at last. 7:41 p.m., Austin, Texas. The house knew me better than he ever could. This kitchen has seen every version of me. Morning coffee spilled on the counter when my hands were younger and rushed. Evening prayers whispered into the sink when grief had nowhere else to go. The floor creaked in the same places it always had, warning you where you stood. That night, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, familiar enough to steady my breathing. This is my ground, I reminded myself. He's the one standing on borrowed space. Daniel remained seated across from me, his posture straight, his jacket still on despite the Texas heat. He looked uncomfortable now, though he wouldn't admit it. Men like him rarely do. The overhead fan rotated slowly, pushing warm air down in lazy circles. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the thin gold band on my finger, the one I never took off. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had settled into something quieter. Resolve doesn't shout, I told myself. It waits. I studied him the way you study a stranger who thinks he knows you. His polished shoes rested on my rug. His briefcase leaned against my chair leg without permission. He spoke again, explaining consequences in a voice meant to sound helpful. I'm trying to make this easier for you, he said. At your age, stability matters. At my age, I repeated silently. The phrase landed heavier than any threat. I had buried a husband, raised children, learned how quickly promises evaporate when ink dries. Stability wasn't something he could offer me. It was something I had earned. The windows reflected us back at ourselves, him sharp-edged and impatient, me smaller than I felt, but unbending. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing softly against asphalt. Life moving on, unaware of negotiations happening at my table. I imagined how this must look to him, an elderly woman boxed in by time, pressured into compliance by paperwork and tone. He mistook my stillness for hesitation. Stillness is not surrender, I thought. It's observation. I let my gaze drift not to the papers, not to his face, but to the manila envelope resting near my elbow. Its edges were worn, corners softened by years of handling. Daniel followed my eyes, just briefly. Those old things won't change what's written here, he said, nodding toward the contract. I almost smiled. Almost. Instead, I nodded, once slow and careful, the way you do when you want someone to keep talking, when you want them comfortable. Inside, something settled firmly into place. Fear had burned off, leaving clarity behind. This house has heard worse than this, I told myself. And it's still standing. I drew a quiet breath, feeling the coolness of the envelope through my sleeve, knowing exactly what waited inside and who else was hearing every word spoken in my kitchen. Daniel leaned back, confident again. That was his mistake. 7:58 p.m., Austin, Texas. Memory has a way of arriving uninvited. While Daniel talked, my mind drifted, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, back into the years that taught me how paper can hurt more than fists, if you let it. I could almost smell the old hospital corridors from decades ago, antiseptic and stale coffee, the place where I first learned what it meant to read every line twice. My husband's signature had once been enough to protect us. After he was gone, it became a liability. That lesson stayed, even when I wished it wouldn't. I thought of the early years in this house, when the walls were bare and the future felt wide open. I was younger then, tired in the good way, working long days, coming home to laughter and noise. Bills were paid by hand, checks balanced at the kitchen table where Daniel now sat. I trusted systems because I believed they were built for people like me. That belief faded slowly, eroded by small betrayals, missed explanations, rushed signatures, polite men who spoke too quickly and listened too little. There was a winter years back when money tightened like a knot. Pipes froze. The roof leaked. I learned how to negotiate with contractors, how to say no without apologizing. I learned that confidence often masquerades as authority. If you don't question it, I remembered thinking then, it will question you instead. That was the year I began keeping records, receipts, notes, copies of everything. Not because I planned to fight, but because I planned to survive. Daniel's voice pulled me back to the present, explaining clauses I already understood. His tone carried impatience now, as if my silence were an inconvenience rather than a choice. He reminded me of men from years ago, men who assumed age dulled awareness, that time erased memory instead of sharpening it. I watched his mouth move and thought of every woman I'd known who had been talked over, rushed past, underestimated. They always think the story starts with them, I thought. It never does. The kitchen light flickered once briefly before steadying. I took it as a sign, not of weakness, but of continuity. This house had endured storms, grief, quiet joys, and long nights of uncertainty. So had I. The manila envelope felt heavier now, not with weight, but with history. It held proof of who I'd been forced to become: careful, patient, prepared. When Daniel paused, waiting for my response, I finally looked up. I didn't speak yet. I just met his eyes and let the years look back at him, the years he hadn't counted on, the years that had taught me one simple truth: nothing given under pressure is ever truly consent. And that was when I knew this moment wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning, taking its time. 8:06 p.m., Austin, Texas. That was when he finally showed himself. Daniel cleared his throat and adjusted his cufflinks. A small, practiced movement that told me more than his words ever could. He leaned forward again, elbows just touching the edge of my table, claiming space that wasn't his. The overhead light caught the silver of his watch as he spoke, and I noticed how carefully he chose his language-soft verbs, firm nouns, no room for negotiation. Men like him don't raise their voices. They lower them, as if control works better in whispers. You don't really need to read every page, he said, offering a tight smile that never reached his eyes. It's all been reviewed already. Reviewed by whom, I wondered. Certainly not by anyone sitting in this chair. My fingers brushed the table's worn edge, feeling the shallow grooves left by years of use. That table had held homework, casseroles, condolence cards. It had never lied to me. Daniel, on the other hand, was already asking me to trust without understanding. He began explaining timelines, how quickly things would move once I signed, how delays would complicate matters. His knee bounced again, faster this time. I noticed how he avoided saying the word home, opting instead for asset, how he referred to my choices as logistical. Those weren't slips. They were tells. You can hear a man's intentions in the words he refuses to use, I thought. When I asked a simple question, why does this transfer clause remove my authority? His expression changed, just for a moment. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before it smoothed itself out. That's standard, he replied, too quickly. It protects everyone involved. Everyone but me, apparently. The room felt tighter then, as if the walls themselves were listening. I shifted in my chair and felt the cool metal of the phone beneath my sleeve still face down, still silent. Daniel sighed, leaning back as though I were the obstacle. Eleanor, let's be realistic, he said gently. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. The word harder landed like a warning wrapped in concern. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from familiarity. Here it is, I thought, the first crack in the mask. I nodded slowly, offering him what he mistook for agreement. Inside, my thoughts sharpened. Pressure always arrives before the truth. I watched as he straightened the papers again, aligning them with unnecessary precision, a man who needed order because he feared losing it. The manila envelope rested unmoved beside me, its presence quiet but undeniable. Daniel tapped the pen against the contract once. "Let's not drag this out," he said. And in that moment, with the clock ticking and the phone listening, I understood something clearly. He wasn't here to help me. He was here to finish something he believed was already done. 8:14 p.m., Austin, Texas. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as efficiency. Daniel slid the contract closer, the paper brushing against my knuckles. "This part is just procedural," he said, tapping the top corner with his pen. "Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was smooth, rehearsed. I picked up the first page anyway. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than ink. The smell of fresh toner mixed with the faint scent of old coffee from my mug, untouched since he arrived. I read slowly. He didn't like that. I could feel his impatience without looking up. My eyes moved line by line until they reached the clause he had tried to skip over, the one written in smaller print, buried where most people wouldn't think to linger. Authority transferred. Decision-making revoked. My name reduced to a formality. "So that's how you plan to do it," I thought. "Not by force, by omission." When I asked about it, his smile thinned. "It's temporary," he said. "Just until everything is settled." "Settled how?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, just long enough to tell on himself. "Legally," he replied. "Not comfortably, not fairly, just legally." The word echoed in my chest, hollow and cold. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I nodded again, the way I had learned to do when someone underestimated me. "Let him believe this is working," I told myself. I set the page down carefully, aligning it with the others. My hands had stopped shaking now. Calm had replaced the initial shock, and with it came something steadier, anger sharpened into focus. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Once this is signed, things will be easier for you," he said. "No more stress, no more responsibility." He said responsibility like it was a burden instead of a right. I glanced at the phone without moving my head, trusting that the quiet on the line meant my lawyer was still there, still listening. Every word Daniel spoke was building something he couldn't see yet. Outside, the cicadas grew louder, their sound pressing against the windows like static. Inside, I folded the corner of the page slightly, then smoothed it back out, a small, private gesture of defiance. "You don't get to take it from me now," I thought. Daniel pushed the pen toward me, the metal clicking softly against the table. "Just sign here," he said, pointing. I reached forward, not for the pen, but for the manila envelope instead. The movement was subtle, but his eyes followed it. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed his face. And I knew then this was only the first betrayal. The others were already waiting. 8:23 p.m., Austin, Texas. This was when the ground started to shift beneath me. The days that followed blurred together in quiet, unsettling ways. Daniel stopped visiting in person, but his presence lingered. Thin envelopes in the mail, clipped phone calls that ended before I finished speaking. The house felt different then, not unsafe, but watched. I noticed it first when the porch light didn't come on one evening, then again when the water ran cold without warning. The heater was mysteriously scheduled for maintenance I hadn't requested. Each small disruption felt accidental on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. I stood at the kitchen window one morning, sunlight slanting across the floor, listening to a recorded message from the utility company. Account changes confirmed. The words echoed long after the call ended. My name wasn't mentioned. I set the phone down slowly, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest, not panic, something closer to disbelief. He's moving faster than he should be able to, I thought. Or someone is letting him. When I confronted Daniel, his response came quickly, too quickly. "You're probably just misremembering," he said lightly. "These things can be confusing." Confusing. The word stung more than an accusation. It wasn't about the lights or the water anymore. It was about erasure, about being slowly written out of decisions that were still legally mine. Neighbors began asking gentle questions. "Everything all right, Eleanor?" they'd say, voices lowered, eyes careful. Shame crept in then, uninvited, not because I had done something wrong, but because that's how control works. It isolates before it conquers. I smiled, reassured them, closed the door, and sat alone at my table, long after the conversation ended. This is how they make you doubt yourself, I thought. One small change at a time. That night, I opened the manila envelope again, spreading its contents across the table. Copies of deeds, notes I had written in careful handwriting, dates, times, names. I added new pages, utility notices, call logs, voicemail transcripts. My fear had quieted, replaced by methodical focus. If he wants confusion, I told myself, I'll give him clarity instead. Daniel called once more, his voice carrying that same patient condescension. "Let's not escalate things," he said. "You don't want unnecessary attention." No, I thought, staring at the silent phone after the call ended. You don't. I placed the phone face down again, just as I had that first night, and slid the envelope shut with deliberate care. Because now I understood something important. The second betrayal wasn't about paperwork. It was about making me invisible. And I was done disappearing. 8:37 p.m., Austin, Texas. This was the moment everything finally broke. Daniel came back in person that evening, unannounced. I heard his knock before I saw him, through the window sharp, impatient, as if time itself belonged to him. The sky outside had darkened into that deep Texas blue that arrives without warning, the air thick and unmoving. When I opened the door, he didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, briefcase in hand, eyes already scanning the room like he was measuring what was left to take. "We need to finish this," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. The kitchen light felt harsher than before, casting hard shadows across the walls. He placed a fresh stack of papers on the table, heavier than the last. My name was printed again, bold and final. I felt my stomach tighten, but I stayed standing, one hand resting on the back of the chair. "Don't sit," I told myself. "Not yet." Daniel's voice sharpened as he spoke, the patience finally gone. "You've delayed long enough," he said. "This isn't optional anymore." He slid the pen toward me with a forceful flick. The metal clink echoed louder than it should have. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, too far to hear clearly, but close enough to feel. "Sign it," he said, meeting my eyes now, his gaze hard. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice to something cold and final. "Or leave." The words hit me like a door slamming shut. For a moment, everything inside me went very still. No fear, no tears, just a clean, unmistakable line being crossed. "So this is who you are," I thought. "And this is what you're willing to say out loud." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my movements slow, unhurried. Daniel frowned, confused. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making sure I'm not alone," I replied quietly. I placed the phone face down on the table, just beside the papers, my thumb pressing the screen once, before I withdrew my hand. He didn't notice the call connecting. He was too busy talking. "You don't have anyone who can stop this," he said, his voice rising now. "You're wasting time, Eleanor." I said nothing. I let him fill the silence. Let him explain. Let him threaten. Every word poured freely into the open line. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The storm outside crept closer. My hands didn't shake when I slid the manila envelope closer to me. That surprised even me. I felt calm strangely, deeply calm. This is it, I realized. This is the line I don't step back from. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw not power, but desperation trying to pass itself off as authority. He finally stopped talking, breathing hard, waiting for my answer. I met his gaze and nodded once, not in agreement, in understanding. Because in that moment, the breaking point wasn't mine. It was his. 8:52 p.m., Austin, Texas. Silence can be louder than refusal. After Daniel left, the house didn't immediately feel peaceful. It felt emptied, like the air itself needed time to settle back into place. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade down the walkway, the front door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made my chest rise and fall a little slower. The storm outside never arrived. The thunder moved on without us. Inside, only the clock remained, ticking faithfully as it always had. I didn't sit right away. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the table, the other still near the phone. My lawyer's voice came through softly at last, calm and steady, asking if I was all right. I answered just as quietly, "Yes, I am now." Saying it out loud made it true. When the call ended, I placed the phone beside the envelope and let myself breathe for the first time all evening. The shame Daniel had tried to plant didn't take root. It hovered briefly, then dissolved. In its place was something firmer determination without drama. I gathered the papers he'd left behind and stacked them neatly, not because they deserved care, but because I did. The overhead light seemed warmer now, less harsh. I noticed how tired my legs felt, how the house creaked softly, as if checking on me. I carried the manila envelope into the living room and sat down at the small desk by the window. Outside, porch lights flickered on one by one along the street. Ordinary life continuing. I opened the envelope and reviewed everything again. Not hurried, not emotional. Dates, clauses, recordings, patterns. This isn't about revenge, I reminded myself. It's about record. Quiet truth has a way of outlasting noise. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what came next. Not confrontation, not escape, but correction. The law doesn't move fast, but it moves deliberately, especially when it's fed patience and proof. I felt no urge to call anyone else, to explain or justify. The story didn't need witnesses yet. It needed structure. I closed the envelope, slid it into my bag, and turned off the kitchen light. As I walked down the hallway, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of alignment. Everything was still uncertain, but it was no longer chaotic. This is the quiet before work begins, I thought. And somewhere beyond this house, beyond Daniel's confidence and threats, a process had already started. One he could no longer interrupt. 9:18 a.m., Austin, Texas. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks precise. Morning light filled the study in clean, deliberate lines, dust motes drifting slowly, as if time itself had agreed to move more carefully. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee, gone lukewarm, the manila envelope open before me like a map. There was no rush in my movements, no anger, only intention. I had learned long ago that real power doesn't announce itself, it organizes. I began with the recordings, each one labeled, dated, transcribed by hand. Daniel's voice sounded different in the daylight, less confident, more exposed. Threats that felt heavy in the moment now sounded careless, almost reckless. Men like him rely on the dark, I thought. They don't expect their words to survive it. I added notes in the margins, small observations that tied tone to intent. This wasn't emotion. This was evidence. Next came the documents he assumed I didn't understand. Property records, transfer attempts, utility authorizations bearing signatures that weren't mine. I cross-checked everything against my own files, the ones he never asked about, the ones I'd kept quietly for years. Inside a second folder thinner, newer sat information he hadn't accounted for at all. A trust. Investments placed carefully, legally, long before Daniel entered my life. I hadn't hidden them out of fear. I had protected them out of wisdom. My lawyer and I spoke briefly that afternoon. No long conversations, just confirmations, next steps, timelines. His voice remained calm, professional, almost reassuring in its restraint. Let him proceed, he said. People reveal the most when they think they're winning. I agreed. Preparation isn't about stopping someone, I thought. It's about letting them finish. By evening, everything had a place. Originals secured, copies made, digital backups, labeled and stored. I closed the envelope and placed it carefully in my bag, feeling its familiar weight settle in. It no longer felt defensive. It felt deliberate, like a tool waiting for the right moment. As I turned off the desk lamp, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. Older, yes. Tired, certainly. But not confused. Not powerless. He thinks this ends with a signature, I thought. It ends with a record. And somewhere, Daniel Crowe was moving forward with his plan, unaware that every step he took was already being measured. 11:02 a.m., Austin, Texas. The moment he thought he'd won. Daniel's message arrived mid-morning, clipped and confident. Final signing scheduled. Witnesses present. Let's resolve this. No greeting, no courtesy, just assumption. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside the manila envelope. Sunlight streamed across the table, catching on the edges of the documents inside, like even the paper was waiting. I felt no rush of nerves, only a quiet readiness settle into place. I chose my clothes carefully that day. Nothing dramatic, neutral colors, comfortable shoes, the kind of outfit that disappears into a room until it doesn't. As I buttoned my coat, I thought of all the times I'd been told to dress my age, act my age, know my place. Today, I thought, I'll let them decide what that looks like. I picked up the envelope last, feeling its reassuring heft, and closed the door behind me. The office Daniel selected was downtown, glass and polished stone, designed to make people feel small before they even sat down. The conference room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and toner. 2 witnesses were already there, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. Daniel stood when I entered, smiling with a confidence that bordered on relief. "I'm glad you came," he said, as if attendance were the same as agreement. We took our seats. Papers were arranged, pens aligned. The ritual began. Daniel spoke smoothly, explaining that everything was in order, that this was simply a formality. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly atop the envelope. Let him build the moment, I reminded myself. Let him step fully into it. When the final document was placed in front of me, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel slid the pen forward, just as he had in my kitchen. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice steady. I picked up the pen, feeling its cool weight between my fingers. The witnesses leaned in slightly. This was the image Daniel wanted, compliance captured in ink. I looked down at the signature line, then up at him. I smiled politely, just enough to keep him comfortable. This is where he thinks the story ends, I thought. This is where it actually begins. I set the pen down, not on the paper, but beside it, and placed my hand on the manila envelope instead. Daniel's smile faltered, just a fraction. 11:14 a.m., downtown Austin. Truth has a sound when it enters a room. The silence stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable. I could hear the faint buzz of traffic through the glass walls, the low hum of the building's air system. Daniel cleared his throat, preparing to speak again. But I moved first. I slid the manila envelope onto the table and opened it with deliberate care, the paper whispering as it unfolded. Now, I thought, now you listen. "My lawyer is on the line," I said calmly, tapping my phone once. Daniel's head snapped up. "That won't be necessary," he replied quickly, a flash of irritation breaking through his composure. But the damage was already done. The speaker clicked on, and my lawyer's voice filled the room, measured unmistakably present. The witnesses shifted in their chairs. The recordings played first, Daniel's voice. His own rang out clear and unedited. "Sign it, or leave." The words landed differently, here stripped of kitchen shadows, echoing off glass and steel instead. One of the witnesses swallowed hard. Daniel's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as if he could physically pull the sound back into himself. Next came the documents. I laid them out one by one, unauthorized utility changes, attempted transfers, discrepancies highlighted in yellow. My lawyer spoke as I moved, calmly, professionally, explaining each violation and its implications. Daniel tried to interrupt once, twice, but every attempt only underscored his panic. Confidence evaporates quickly when confronted with its own reflection. Then I reached into the envelope again and placed the final folder on the table. Thinner, cleaner, untouched by his hands. "This," my lawyer said, "is Ms. Whitfield's trust." Daniel froze. He hadn't known. He hadn't asked. Numbers were mentioned, not shouted, not flaunted, just stated. Enough to shift the balance of the room. The assumption that I was desperate collapsed quietly under its own weight. I watched Daniel in that moment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. He had built his plan on a single belief, that I was alone, confused, and cornered. He was wrong on all three counts. The witnesses no longer avoided my eyes. They looked at him instead. My lawyer finished speaking. The room was still again, but it was a different kind of stillness now, one that follows truth, not threat. Daniel gathered his papers with trembling hands. His authority was gone, his words suddenly cautious. I said nothing. I didn't need to, because everything that mattered had already been said. 11:29 a.m., downtown Austin. This is what accountability feels like. No one rushed to speak after the recordings ended. The witnesses sat straighter now, no longer spectators, but participants. One of them cleared her throat softly, eyes moving between Daniel and the documents spread across the table. The glass walls that had once felt intimidating now worked against him. Everything was visible, nothing hidden. I folded my hands calmly in front of me, feeling the smoothness of the tabletop beneath my palms. Daniel tried once more to regain control. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice lower than before, cautious. The word misunderstanding drifted uselessly in the air. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and spoke for the first time since the reveal. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. "You gave me an ultimatum in my own home," I said. "You spoke as if my consent didn't matter." My voice didn't waver. Truth doesn't need volume, I reminded myself. I turned slightly toward the witnesses, including them now. I asked questions. I was dismissed. I was pressured. And when I resisted, my utilities were altered and my authority challenged. Each sentence landed with measured precision. I wasn't defending myself. I was documenting. The difference mattered. Daniel shifted in his seat, his pen forgotten, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. My lawyer spoke again, outlining next steps, formal complaints, investigations, potential consequences. The language was professional, restrained, unavoidable. This wasn't a confrontation fueled by emotion. It was a record being established in real time. I watched as Daniel's shoulders sagged under the weight of it, the realization settling in that this room would not be forgotten. When I stood, the meeting ended without ceremony. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just the quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. One of the witnesses met my eyes and nodded, a small gesture, but an important one. Recognition replaces dismissal when truth is allowed to stand. As I gathered my envelope and turned toward the door, Daniel remained seated, staring at the table as if answers might appear there if he waited long enough. I felt no triumph, only relief. This is what it feels like to be heard, I thought. And outside that glass room, the world continued, now aware of what had been spoken inside. 2:46 p.m. Austin, Texas. Power doesn't fall loudly. It thins out, then disappears. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in quiet confirmations, emails acknowledged, calls returned, meetings scheduled without Daniel's name attached to them anymore. I noticed it first when my lawyer forwarded a brief message. He's been removed from the case pending review. No flourish, no explanation, just a line where authority used to be. Word traveled faster than I expected. Not as gossip, but as caution. Professionals are careful people. They notice patterns and remember records. Daniel's once constant presence in conversations faded. Invitations stopped including him. His voice, so confident before, became hesitant when it appeared at all. This is how reputation works, I thought. It isn't destroyed. It's abandoned. Neighbors sensed the shift too, though they didn't know the details. The utility issues were corrected without argument. Apologies arrived from companies that had previously brushed me aside. My name reappeared where it had been quietly removed. Each correction felt small on its own, but together they formed something unmistakable: restoration. Not a favor, a correction of record. I ran into Daniel once, weeks later, in a parking lot outside an office building I had no reason to enter anymore. He looked smaller somehow, his suit less sharp, his movements cautious. He nodded at me, not meeting my eyes. I returned the nod, neither kind nor cruel. There was nothing left to say. He had lost the one thing he relied on most: credibility. What stayed with me wasn't his downfall, but the way others adjusted once the truth was known. Doors opened more carefully. Conversations slowed. People listened. The absence of his influence revealed how fragile it had been all along. Power that depends on silence never survives being heard, I thought. That evening, back in my kitchen, I placed the manila envelope in the drawer where it had started. It no longer felt like armor. It felt like a record completed. I turned off the light, listening to the house settle around me. Whole again. Justice hadn't shouted. It had simply remained. 6:11 p.m., Austin, Texas. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, sweating gently against my palm. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, the light softening everything it touched. The air smelled of cut grass and warm earth. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders relaxed without me having to remind them to. This is what quiet feels like when it isn't fragile, I thought. I didn't replay the meeting in my head the way I once might have. There was no need. The outcome had already found its place. Instead, my thoughts drifted to the years that had led me here, the moments I'd been told to wait, to trust, to not make trouble. I realized how often I had mistaken endurance for acceptance. You can endure something without agreeing to it, I told myself gently. That distinction felt like a gift I was only now unwrapping. Inside the house, the lights glowed warmly through the windows. I could hear the faint sound of a radio playing in a neighbor's yard, a familiar song carried on the evening air. Ordinary life continuing unchanged. And yet, for me, everything felt different. Not because I had won, but because I had been steady. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged. I had simply refused to disappear. I stood and walked back inside, my footsteps unhurried. I opened the drawer and touched the manila envelope one last time before closing it again. Its job was done. The house felt lighter now, as if it could finally exhale. I poured the rest of the tea down the sink and rinsed the glass, listening to the water run clear. As I turned off the lights and headed down the hallway, I felt something settle deep inside me, peace, earned rather than granted. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. I am still here, I thought, and that is enough. Tomorrow would come, as it always does. But tonight, I rested. 9:02 p.m., Austin, Texas. Some endings don't close doors. They return keys. The house was quiet in the way only a lived-in home can be. Not empty, not lonely, just settled. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the lights dimmed, the same table still bearing faint scratches from years of ordinary life. Nothing about the room had changed, and yet everything had. That's how you know the fight is over, I thought. When peace doesn't need rearranging. I walked slowly from room to room, touching familiar things, the back of a chair, the edge of a bookshelf, the door frame where I once measured a child's height in pencil. These walls had witnessed my fear, my patience, my resolve. They had listened without judgment. They had held me steady when others tried to move me aside. This place remembers me, I realized, and I remember myself again. What Daniel never understood, what men like him often miss, is that age doesn't make you weaker. It makes you precise. It teaches you which battles are loud distractions, and which ones are quiet truths waiting to be spoken. I didn't need to punish him. I didn't need to humiliate him. I only needed to stand still long enough for his own words to catch up with him. I returned to the kitchen and sat at the table, folding my hands just as I had that first night. The manila envelope rested in its drawer now, no longer a shield, no longer a weapon, just a record, proof that dignity can be documented, that consent matters, that silence, when chosen, can be stronger than shouting. Before heading to bed, I turned off the last light and paused in the doorway. I felt tired, but it was the good kind, the kind that follows clarity. They told me to sign or leave, I thought. I chose neither. I chose to stay, to listen, to remember who I was before anyone tried to decide for me. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a woman who refuses to move,